We're going to finish up tables in this video, and you may want to be able to break your table up into a head, a body, and a foot. In other words, you want to distinguish between the body, which is the meat of the table itself, the headings that describe what is below them, and footers that may be some type of summary of sorts of the columns of each column. If the table is too long to show on a screen, the header and footer might remain in view all the time, whereas the body of the table gains a scroll bar so that you could scroll through it. When printing a long table that spreads out over more than one page, you might even want the browser to print the head and foot of the table on each page. Well, browsers at this point do not yet support these ideas, although there are options to implement this using CSS and JavaScript. If you add these elements to your tables, you can use CSS to attach different styles to the contents of different sections. Again, this will be clearer to us when we actually start talking about CSS. It can also help those who are using screen readers and such like that, which read pages to the users. The three elements for separating the head, body, and foot of a table are the T-head, that separates a separate table header, the T-body to indicate the main body, and T-foot, which is for the footer. A table may also contain several T-body elements to indicate different pages or groups of data as well. Now, all three of these elements would be contained inside of the table element itself, and they would be direct children. Then the TRs would be children of these three. So let's take a look at one. And in this sample, you can see we have T header that comes directly underneath the table, and then a TR in that, and it has THs, so these are all going to be bold. It also has a foot section, and even though this is going to be displayed at the bottom of the page, it actually is placed before the T-body. Well, what this indicates is that no matter what order you place the T-head, T-foot, T-body, the browsers know how to put them back together. So the browser will always put the header on top, then the body, and then the footer below that, no matter what order you might place them in. And then lastly, we have actually in this one two body tags. You see the one here, and then down below you can see the second one being started here. So if we were doing paging, then these would alternate between the different pages. Now again, we have the T-head, then the T-foot, which is a summary or total of the columns. And if we look at this at our browser, you will see that even though the footer was above the body, it is being displayed at the bottom after the body. You can use the column group element to explain what columns that are related or grouped together. This comes directly after the opening table tag and carries a span attribute. The span attribute then indicates how many columns the group contains. If we look at example 7, you'll see the column group immediately after the table. The first column group spans 4 columns and is going to implement the class main columns. That's just giving us a light gray background color and setting the width to 50 pixels. The second group would be the next 2 columns, and they're going to be a darker gray background and twice the width. Now, how this works is if we look into this, you could see that we have 6 rows. So this first one is referring to the first 4, and this one is referring to the next 2 after the first 4. So if we look at this now in our browser, you can see that the first 4 have a lighter gray background and are 50 pixels wide, while the next 2 are the darker gray background and twice the width. So you can see how that works. Now, what if we didn't want anything done to the first two and we only wanted the middle two to be light gray? Well, we could change this to 2. We would also add a column group, give it a span of 2, but we won't give it any class to assign anything to. So we're not going to assign it either one of these classes, and we'll be talking about these when we talk about CSS a little bit later in the course. Right now we're using those to format these two spans. Well, now that we've changed this, save it, and then we'll take a look at it in our browser again. You see now that the first two have no formatting. The second two have the light gray background, and the last two have the darker gray and the wider width. So you have to account for the columns if you're going to format everything. You can't just skip 2 and do 2 more. So this would be the way of skipping 2. We could have also done this in the middle by doing this. The first 2 then would have had the light gray background and the 50 pixels. The second 2 would have been the default formatting, and the third one would have been the dark column. So that's the column group. The column element was introduced to specify attributes of the columns in a column group. So we had those column group of 4. Well, within that column group of 4, they may all share some properties, but some of them might want to have something different done to them. So unlike the column group element, the column element does not imply structural grouping and is therefore more commonly used for presentational purposes. The column elements are always empty elements. They do not have any content, although they do carry attributes. So once again, we got a table with 6 columns. Notice that we have the column group with a span of 6, and then within that column group, we're telling the first 5 columns, by way of the class being main columns, to have that light gray background with 50 pixels of width. And then the last column, which is the total column, has the darker gray and 100 pixels. So if we look at this in our browser, you see the results of that. And the same thing would apply again as in the last example. If you didn't want anything done to the first 2, you would have a column with a span of 2 and no class indicated, and then obviously this would have to be changed to 3 instead of 5. Nested tables. You can actually place a table within another table. Technically, while it's within the table itself, it must be within a TD cell or a TH cell. They should be used sparingly because they're hard for those who rely on screen readers to follow. This was done a lot back in the days when we used tables for layout in order to get our page layout to look the way we want it. That's no longer true, so a lot of times nesting tables is really not that needed in order to display the information that you want to display in the table. So if we look at this, here's our outside table. First row, second row, they all have 3 cells in them. Here's our third row, but notice the third cell has an entire table nested inside of it. And again, it must come between the opening TD tag and the closing TD tag in order for this to work properly. So in our table that has 3 rows, each row had 3 cells in it. But in the third row, the third cell is actually going to have 2 rows with 2 cells inside of it. So let's take a look at what this looks like when it's actually produced. So you can see now in our third row, our third cell, we have 2 different rows as well as 2 different columns. So we actually were able to split this as opposed to combining them like we did with the column span or the row span. Here we're taking a cell and splitting it up by way of a nested table. Making tables accessible for those who listen to pages on a voice browser or screen readers. For those two devices, things can be a lot harder to understand. But you can make tables a lot easier for all to understand by following a few tips. First of all, make sure you add caption to your tables. The caption element clearly associates a caption with the table, and the screen reader can read the caption to users before they see the table so they know what to expect. If the listener knows what to expect, it is easier to understand the information that is read back to them. Always try to use the TH element to indicate a table heading. Always put headings in the first row and the first column. Avoid using nested tables. This could make it harder for the user of a screen reader to actually follow what's in there. Avoid using row span and column span attributes. Those make it harder for the user with a screen reader to follow. And if you do use them, make sure that you use the scope and header attributes that we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. Learn how a voice browser or screen reader would read a table and the order in which the cells are read out. This can help you to understand how to structure your tables for maximum ease of use. If you use the scope and header attributes to clearly indicate which headings apply to which rows and columns, screen readers can help users retrieve headings for a particular cell. If you can imagine someone having a table read to them, the screen reader often gives the user an option to hear the headers that are relevant to that cell again. When a screen reader is used to read a table, it tends to perform linearization. That just means that the reader starts at the first row and reads the cell in that row from left to right, one by one, before moving on to the next row and so on until the reader has read each row in a table. Most screen readers can remind users of the column and row they are currently in. This works better when the tables use TH elements for headers. If you build a complex table, you can also enhance this information using the ID, scope, and headers attributes. When you make a cell a heading, adding the scope attribute to the TH element helps you indicate which cells that element is the heading for. If you give it the value of row, you indicate that this element is a header for that row. Given the value of column, it indicates that it is a header for that column. You can also have values for a row group or column group. So you can see here how those four values of the scope, how they're intended to be used. Again, if the value is row, the cell contains header information for that row. If it's column, COL, the cell contains header information for that column. A row group, the cell contains header information for that row group. A group of cells in a row created by using the T-head, T-body, or T-foot elements. There is no corresponding element for columns like column group element. And then the column group contains header information that the column group, which is a group of columns created using the column or column group element. The headers attribute performs the opposite role of the scope attribute. It is used on the TD elements, as opposed to the TH, to indicate which headers correspond to that cell. The value of the attribute is a space-separated list of the header cell's ID attribute values. So if it was headers and income space Q1, it is referring to the TH elements that have the ID of income and G1. More likely, one of those is a TH for the row and the other is a TH for the column. The main purpose of this attribute is to support voice browsers. When a table is ready to you, it can be hard to keep track of which row and column you're on. The header attribute reminds users then of which row and column the current cell's data belongs to. And that's the end of lectures on tables.